Ta-da! I'm here. Welcome back to the live stream. My name is Nick Dagan Best. I don't have the microphone close enough to my mouth. And welcome to this Monday's live solo stream. Where to begin? Well, Patrick and I did a live stream, a team stream yesterday. It was pretty good, but I thought we sort of wandered. We didn't talk about astrology as much as we usually do. And yeah, we opted when we started this, at least to get started. This might become more sort of refined as we go, but when we started, the basic idea was let's just shoot the shoot, as they say, and put it on camera, let people just uh, witness, participate in even our conversations about astrology, and let things take whatever course they do. And that's a working strategy largely, but the hazard is always that conversation will just veer too far off topic, and if we're not trying to sort of adhere to a specific subtopic or something like that, things can just really go awry. Okay, well, I'm already getting some people enjoyed it. I certainly hope so. It's not like we had a bad time, and yeah, it's sort of in the spirit of how we're doing the live streams, it was perfectly fine. But we do appreciate um, people giving up their time to listen to us talk, and presumably they're doing it not just out of the kindness of their hearts, but because um, they want to hear what we have to say. And speaking of which, we've jumped right into the questions here. MTMT is asking, Nick, what does being a white 1A mean? Does it have specific characteristics? Thank you. Yeah, as I've explained a few times here, the intervals are still being sort of fleshed out in terms of characteristics. What I've mostly noticed, the reason I introduced them, firstly, the reason I decided they were something that needed to be identified and created here. I'm just going to open my white 1 as I ramble here. The reason I did it, firstly, was because I noticed in transit studies of nativities, I was seeing a lot of recurring Venus retrogrades, like in the life of Roman Polanski, I was seeing a lot of red 1 Venus Aries, Venus retrograde in Aries events in the lives of Charlie Chaplin and Adolf Hitler, who were born 4 days apart during a red 1 interval. This is one of the subjects we're covering on the Astrology podcast. In both of their lives, there are just recurring events over and over that always occur during red 1. And I was noticing, I mean, at the time I had the red 1 thing didn't exist. I came up with the notion of identifying the cycle, of breaking it down and identifying it this way, specifically because it became a little more, what I became aware of is that if I tried to just talk about like the Venus retrograde in Aries, the thing is that same cycle, the red 1, as I now call it, just a few decades previously had been in Taurus. For instance, Hitler and Chaplin were born with Venus retrograde in Taurus, but by the time Hitler died by his own hand at the age of 56, which was a Venus synodic return in itself, he killed himself 10 days after his 56th birthday. And Venus was retrograde in Aries by then. So I wanted some way to sort of explain how Hitler being born with Venus retrograde in Taurus, but killing himself when Venus retrograde was in Aries, how that still belonged to this one part of the phase, which we call red 1, or this interval in the phase. So it was that kind of thinking that eventually that made me think, okay, we need to be able to identify the Venus synodic cycle and its different components in a framework and terminology that is not, glued to the tropical zodiac. That is like a sort of a pivoting wheel that revolves itself around the tropical zodiac, or even the sidereal zodiac for that matter. I mean, there's no reason. I've presented this material to a room full of Indian astrologers in Kolkata, India, because I mean, even if you're a Vedic astrologer and you're using a different zodiac, that's the beauty of this system. I mean, there's still something very astrological about this that I think would still be useful in any system. And by virtue of that, like um, I've managed to interest astrologers from different from such vastly different schools of thought and approach to this method, because it's so universal and doesn't have to be. It can fit into any astrological model, but it's not glued to it. It's something that sort of exists outside of those systems and is a system in and of itself. Right. So that being said, MT's question is valid. I have a couple of thoughts. They're not terribly sophisticated or well developed. They're observations based on who I've looked at so far. With some degree of attention. Right. So here we are. I went right to the bad guy. This goes out to Michelle Ibarra, who was also a white one. White A, and was a little distraught that I only pointed out all the terrible people who were white ones, like Henry Kissinger. But I see, the James Dean is kind of there's something sort of cool and detached I find about the white ones. Ray Manzarek of the Doors, Peter Fonda. Right away, Peter Fonda and James Dean. Both these guys who are like, American icons of the open road, that kind of thing, freedom, rebellion. Marvin Gaye, Harvey Keitel, Iggy Pop, Ron Wood, people of this nature. But then you get some supremely uncool people, for want of a better term, Chief Justice John Roberts, Mitt Romney, Kim Campbell, who was very briefly Canada's prime minister, the only woman prime minister that Canada's ever had. Rather ignominiously voted out of office as soon as she was up for election. Dan Quayle, another conservative Canadian prime minister. We had three white one Canadian prime ministers, all really, really uncool people. Brian Mulroney being the third. So for a little while, Canada, for some reason, really enjoyed having white one conservative prime ministers. Why? I don't know. This is part of my ongoing thing. Vice President Dan Quayle, who until George, he was on par with George W. Bush for intelligence, like just a really, really stupid person. So there's this interesting line between, here's another cool guy, Angus Young of AC/DC. This isn't much to go on. I realize it's very superficial. As I go through my historic examples, you get some like monarchs in the 19th century, Queen Victoria, and the justly despised King Leopold II of Belgium. Probably the most evil. This is the one that triggered poor Michelle. Probably the most evil man of the 19th century, which is really saying something. There was quite a bit of evil going around at the time. But yeah, look, largely I'm still in the stage where I'm it's like I'm collecting insects and pinning them to a wall and labeling them and studying them in all kinds of contexts, and I'm not going to pretend I have that part all sorted out. Where the intervals really have sort of spoken loudest is in transits, as sort of recurring transits in the lives of given individuals. That has been where the power has really been so far. Okay, bliss to be okay. I guess this is going to be one of those days where everyone wants to know what their interval's like, but that's okay. All three had issues with young girls, large age gaps. Okay, I forget what the context of that is, crushed orchids, but we're going to keep moving on. Okay, so Tavian has a question here. Anything notable about white twos? White twos. Well, white twos and black twos, those are the two intervals where the American presidential elections occur. And, excuse me. I found, I mean, this isn't sort of a personal observation, more of a geopolitical one, but I have found that like in the American sort of mythos of politics, you get these black twos and white twos who are very oh yes, okay, yes, of course, thank you, Chris Orchids. Chaplin has Hitler and Polanski, the magical trio. Um, very true. Sorry, where was I? I sometimes get distracted. Oh yes, white twos and black twos. White twos and black twos. You get these sort of people who are very controversial in the um, in the American mythos. Like they'll be really really popular with some people, but also equally unpopular with others. I mean, that's when the first person I think of when I think of white two for some reason is Eleanor Roosevelt. Now, personally, I really like Eleanor Roosevelt largely. You know, I respect the values she stood for and the vision that she sort of incorporated into American politics. But you know, at the same time, there are people who just absolutely, you know, hated her for reasons that I'm sure made sense to them. Um, and so I mean that's just like one name that comes to mind. But here I've opened up my white too, and let's just yeah, that's the thing is we'll explore this together. Like I said, I don't when it comes to sort of breaking this down to types, I don't pretend to have it really really well locked down. I mean, I still am a horoscopic astrologer. I still use the tropical zodiac. I still think of someone having Venus and Virgo versus someone having Venus and Libra has all the well, all the ways we contrast Venus being in one sign or another. But I've just noticed in the lives of people that these intervals and phases really sort of set up a framework under which like this person's life evolves and is always sort of present in these really important turning points. And so from there, I built up developed the system and started figuring out where all the people whose lives I study where they fell in the system. So yeah, maybe talking this through helps us sort of discover some of these things together. So let me share my screen. I'll talk about some white twos here. Okay, so like I said, the first person I think of is Eleanor Roosevelt. So she's got Venus and Virgo here. She's born in October of 1884. So, like I said, the white twos and the black twos, these are when the presidential elections happen. When Trump was elected in 2016, it was during a white two interval, whereas when Biden defeated Trump in 2020, it was during a black two interval. And if you go back through, all the elections, they always happen in that first Tuesday of November or first Tuesday of November, I believe. Yeah, it'll always be during a white two interval and always has been. So let's see, I'll go back to the beginning and just sort of take you through people I have here. So like, okay, Benedict Arnold. Talk about sort of like, yeah, American icons who are hated. I guess, no one really likes Benedict Arnold. Ostensibly, being a Canadian, I'm supposed to like him because he wound up siding with the British, but Benedict Arnold had also led the attempted invasion of Quebec and Montreal during the Revolutionary War. So even we're not supposed to sort of think of him that before he wound up becoming a traitor, is one of the things he did. So yeah, he's a very sort of polarizing figure to be sure, although maybe not as controversial, maybe more universally loathed everywhere. The first white two president was William Henry Harrison, who still holds the record for the shortest presidency. He died a month into his term during a red one interval. He's the first white two interval president. I think he might be the first white interval president. I have to go back and look at that. I can look at that in a minute. But he's the first president to die in office, and the first of how many? Six? Yeah, the first of six U.S. presidents to die during a red one interval, four of which occurred in office. Is that right? I have to go back and look at the math. I'm screwing up my figures here. And then we have Pierce, another he was a one-term president, not terribly, popular or successful. He, sort of he was very his child had been accidentally killed in an accident, after he was elected, but before he was inaugurated. Excuse me. And so the one term he did serve, his wife was going through mourning as any mother would, losing a child, and um, I think he was a bit distracted. But yeah, a lot of unfortunate things happened under his watch, so he's not terribly high regarded. I think he just really wasn't in any shape to run the country, even if he had his head screwed on straight. So he's a white too. He's another one who's sort of not regarded as a very successful president. Um, there is Disraeli, who conversely in Great Britain is probably one of the most important prime ministers in Great Britain of this era. He's a real champion of British colonialism. I mean, this is the guy who crowns Queen Victoria Empress of India, and takes India under direct British control after the Sepoy uprising in 1857. So he's certainly controversial for anyone who, or really loathed by anyone who is opposed to empire, and sort of that certainly the excesses of British Empire as they got worse and worse over the course of the 19th century. So he's certainly sort of a figure of controversy in that regard, depending on where you stand on all that. Oh yeah, there's some Confederates. Okay, well, Fremont's not a Confederate. He's the guy who founded the Republican Party back when they were the good guys. He and he led the expeditions to the West that helped sort of establish California and bring California into the American mold. And yeah, he was the Republican candidate in the election before Abe Lincoln. 1856, the first time a Republican ran for president. He was the guy before Lincoln. And then we get a couple of Confederates, right? We get Longstreet, who was a Confederate general, and Breckinridge, who was the Confederate Secretary of War. He had been Vice President of the U.S., I think, under Pierce, if I'm not mistaken. So I think like Pierce, that presidency had a white two president and a white two vice president. Gee, if you're a white too and you're watching this, you're just gonna think like, gosh, everyone in America is gonna hate me. I'm sure I'll come up against um, some counterbalance. Like, well, we know Eleanor Roosevelt's coming up. This is another Confederate, a guy who'd been Attorney General of the U.S., but then went on to become a Confederate Army colonel. And yeah, then this guy Bayard was Secretary of State. I think he was one of Roosevelt's Secretaries of State. This is Abe people all over the world. So yeah, I have to sort of work on being attentive to that. I don't know if I have to stop being sarcastic, but I have to be very aware that if I'm being sarcastic, that not everyone's gonna pick it up, and that's on me. I shouldn't just say, well, that's their problem if they can't understand me. I must try harder. So that's part of my inner dialogue delivered on the outside. All right. So yeah. So he was eventually excuse me. He was eventually caught and hanged. He was executed after a trial, and his execution is he's really sort of a martyr for a number of minorities in Canada, including Canadian Indians who are fighting sort of federal control, and also for French Canadians who also see his execution as an oppression against them. So yeah, he's a very important figure in Canadian history. Um, and yeah, certainly in Montreal, even though he was executed out west, certainly in Quebec, still a sort of a revered martyr for a cause. And then we go to another sort of extreme. This is Karl Lueger, who was mayor of Vienna in Austria in the 19th century, and he was a populist, and he was vocally anti-Semitic, and likely, I mean, he's often cited as being a really big influence on Adolf Hitler. So, yeah, that's him. Then we have Sultan Mehmed of the Ottoman Empire. Um, and yeah, he's basically he led his empire into the First World War. He's the second to last sultan, but he's like basically a figurehead, as was the guy who replaced him. And this is in just the very end of the Ottoman Empire, so not a terribly effective leader. But if I'm not mistaken, there's a lot of white two Ottomans. Yeah, like earlier, I had two earlier Ottoman sultans who were also white too. So I think I noted that there seems to be, like, in the last couple of centuries of the Ottoman Empire, there seemed to be a lot of white twos. And of course, the last couple of centuries of the Ottoman Empire was a sort of slow dissolution for them. So not their peak by any stretch. Now I have a lot of these. I can keep going. How many do I have? Well, 80. I guess we could go through all 80. If all we do today is talk about white two, but I don't know if I've really answered the question. Let me just go back to the chat here. Oh no, my connection. Okay, I don't know if anyone can see me. I'm not getting the comments. This is concerning. Shoot. Oh dear. Okay, folks, I'm really sorry. I'm gonna end the stream. I don't know if anyone can see it or not. I don't want to waste my time. Has something gone wrong with my Wi-Fi? I really don't know. It says 16 people are watching me. It says the recording is still going on. Let me just go to my YouTube. Maybe I don't want to give up just yet. All right. It looks like I am. Okay. Oh, shoot. Okay. So it looks like I did disappear for a little bit. I'm seeing the chat here. It's not showing up in my Restream window. There's some workmen working outside where I live, and maybe they're screwing up my Wi-Fi, which is a real drag. If that's the case, I'm gonna have to go yell at construction workers, which I promise you is, not pleasant. Um, all right, excuse me. Well, I'm just gonna carry on. Either people can see what I'm doing or not. I'll just, hit refresh. I'm worried about hitting refresh. If I hit refresh, am I gonna end the stream? I don't know, crushed orchids. I'm worried about trying that. I think I'm just gonna keep talking and check in periodically to make sure that, um, that the stream's still going through. Someone please say something now to make sure that the comments are still coming through. Okay. No one's saying anything. Oh dear. Oh dear. Oh, we are cool. You're still live. Okay. All right. Okay. Um, all right. Well, I can just sort of keep taking us through this list. Someone wants to know who white twos are. It's not necessarily the most productive use of our time. Oh yeah, you want some good. I told you about all these terrible white twos. Well, you do get John Lennon, you do get Leonard, Little Richard, you do get Terry Gilliam, Bruce Lee, Richard Pryor, Graham Chapman. So two guys in Monty Python. That's crazy. But you got to take your Dick Cheneys. You got to take your Theresa Mays and your Kamala Harrises and um, there's some good and bad in all these. Hey, you get Jimmy Carter, but you also get William Rehnquist. By the way, they were born the exact same day, which is a study I keep meaning to sort of do more work on, because I'm always excited by having two time charts of notable figures born on the same day. And it's especially interesting because, Jimmy Carter being a Democratic president, certainly as 20th century presidents go, he's amongst the most liberal. And then you get William Rehnquist, who first was an associate justice with the Supreme Court appointed by Nixon. And then later Reagan sort of boosted him to chief justice once Berger died, Warren Berger. So yeah, and he was a very sort of conservative judge, not as conservative as like Alito or people like that, but up there. Um, so yeah, there's a real sort of mixed bag. You get some Nazis, you get a few Nazis. You're always going to get some Nazis in the mix. And then this guy was a fascist who was killed by Nazis because he was a chancellor of Austria. Um, yeah, more Nazis. I remember that there were quite a few white two Nazis executed in Nuremberg. Like this guy Streicher was just like the worst of the worst, and he was executed at Nuremberg. Goering committed suicide just before he was going to be executed at Nuremberg. Alfred Rosenberg, who was like a Nazi historian and ideologue, he was executed at Nuremberg. And then Himmler, of course, took himself out of the picture. But he very likely would have been executed at Nuremberg if he hadn't committed suicide also. So yeah, there's some Nazis, but then you get your Eleanor Roosevelt. Oh yeah, and this guy also, yeah, I forgot there was a lot of white twos. This guy kind of got out of, he was at Nuremberg, he was tried at Nuremberg, but he was acquitted. Some people say because he led his left his post in 1938, so he wasn't really responsible for the Holocaust. And in fact, he did spend time in a concentration camp himself. But other people think he was acquitted just because the Americans wanted his banking genius. He was friends with Dulles, not John Allen Dulles, who would be the head of the CIA, and later, and the Dulles brothers were total Nazi sympathizers. So there's that sort of thing involved. Rasputin, he's a sort of notorious figure in Russian history, sort of a mystic who contributed to the poor reputation that the Romanov family had during the First World War and led to the Russian Revolution. That was part of what led to it. Well, look at that. I found another Ottoman Sultan who's a white too. See, it's fun to just sort of move around and see who comes up, and you do get these interesting groupings. But again, I'm not going to pretend to have any sort of real answers, like why are so many, why is a large proportion of the Nazis who were executed at Nuremberg, why are they white Jews? Why were so many of the last sultans of the Ottoman Empire white Jews? I have no idea, but it's just interesting that they get sort of sorted out that way. And if you've seen previous episodes I've done, that tends to be the case, where you just see a concentration of a given interval, people born during a given interval in a certain sort of historical context or situation. And so I'm mostly trying to find out why that is, and how is it relevant. Okay. All right. Some of you are excited about Rasputin. Okay. And you're enjoying the presentation. All right, cool. Well, this is easy enough. I like, I like talking about these. I know some of them are sort of obscure and not necessarily really consequential on their own, but when you take them together as a sort of mass of people to study, then it does become interesting. Shall I maybe explore like another interval? I was going to also show you black 2 as which is sort of the polar to the white 2. I've talked about black 2 before, but it'd be fun to sort of take you through the slide in the same way I took you through these. Yeah, Rasputin. Well, the thing about Rasputin here, if you think Rasputin's interesting, this is exactly how I want to work. I want you guys to sort of gleam onto something that I mentioned, and then I can go into it in detail. So why don't we try this? Is this the one I want? No, let's just go with the... Gonna have a look at this, some Russian history, because they're actually the synodic intervals with Russian history. There's always a lot to cover there. But I'll zero in on the period when Rasputin was alive and relevant, because he's quite the outlier, which sort of stands to reason. Historically, he certainly was as well. There had been the Romanovs actually did have another mystic influencer before him. I'm just going to wait for that to open while I talk to you guys. Before Rasputin came along, first I should just tell you the story. I covered the sort of the long version of this history in an earlier stream, but it's worth covering again. At the turn of the 18th century, Catherine the Great, her son, hated his mother, so that when he ascended to throne, his name was Paul, Tsar Paul I. When he ascended to the throne and became Tsar of Russia, the first thing he did was proclaim a new law that forbid women from being Tsar ever again. He saw his mother as being a German usurper. She had his father killed, basically, which is largely true. And so he banned women from being Tsar, which didn't turn out to be like a direct problem for the Romanov dynasty until we got sort of like 4 or 5 generations later to Nicholas II, who was the last Tsar of Russia. Now, what happened with him? Now, as we know, that European royals were inbred. There's no other sort of term for it, and that causes birth defects. And hemophilia was already something that other members of other royal families were suffering from by the time Nicholas II became Tsar. And his wife was a granddaughter of Queen Victoria, and she carried these sort of very damaged genes. Is that the way to put it? I don't know if that's a correct wording, but I'm just going to run with it. I think of it that way anyway. And they had 4 daughters who were perfectly healthy and well educated and well behaved and by all accounts sensible people. And then he had a son who, of course, would be the heir to the throne, even though he had four older siblings. And the son, born in 1904, turned out to be a hemophiliac. And this became a problem. I mean, you would think it shouldn't be, but it was because the Romanovs, the Tsar and his wife were worried that the Russian people would, blame them and think of them as being cursed and sort of, overthrow the dynasty. So they kept it a secret from the Russian people. But the Tsarina was always trying to find a way to um, somehow heal, her son from hemophilia, which by all even today is not really possible. Um, and they came upon this mystic Rasputin, who was recommended to them by some family members. Sort of a psychic. He had very sort of mystical looking eyes. Where do I put up his picture again? I've got the slide open now. All right, I'll share my screen again. There we are. Yeah, exactly. He would be a cult leader if he was alive today. And yeah, I think there are a lot of Rasputins today. So, the truth be told, he probably had some gifts as a hypnotist. There's a really famous story. I mean, it's not even a hypnotist. It's just that, sort of accidental great advice. So Rasputin was helping um, the young boy, um, just in terms of attention and comfort as he suffered. But eventually, there was sort of a reaction against Rasputin. Remember, the rest of Russia, including other members of the royal family, didn't know that the boy had hemophilia. So the fact that Rasputin was in the palace and hanging out with the family made the rest of Russia, and certainly the rest of the royal family, that made them think that, that the Tsar had been bewitched, that they were sort of under the spell of this guy, because they didn't know the reason for it. I mean, it's such a terrible, terrible misunderstanding, given the consequences. So eventually, the Tsar was pressured to banish Rasputin back to Siberia, where he's from. But then, while Rasputin was in Siberia, the boy had some kind of fall, I think, or something happened, and his hemophilia was really bad, and they weren't sure he would survive, and the doctors were attending to him. And they sent a panicked telegram to Rasputin all the way in Siberia, and he telegrammed back, and he said, have the doctors leave him alone and don't let them give him any medicine. And this happened, and the next day the boy recovered. Well, the thing that the medicine that the doctors had been giving the boy was sort of like aspirin, like blood thinners, which is not good for a hemophiliac. So there's sort of like a lucky the thinking is that there's like a kind of a Rasputin has a lucky break in that, telling them to keep the doctors away and to not take any of the medicine, even though he's probably um, he doesn't have any medical expertise, but it just turns out to be really good advice in the moment, and that restores his and reinforces the Tsar and Tsarina's faith in him as a healer. Like, oh my God, he saved the boy from by telegram all the way in Siberia. This guy has all these mystical powers. So ultimately, Rasputin was eventually murdered. In a plot that was done in part by there were three men directly involved in the plot, and one of them was sort of like the adopted son of the Tsar, a man who the Tsar had raised as his own son. He was like a nephew of his, and one of the parents or both of the parents had died. And so the Tsar so Rasputin was murdered in December of 1916, and within 2 months, the Russian Revolution was really sort of beginning. And the First World War was going on, all that stuff. So just to sort of take you through it, some of this other stuff here. So Out of the Romanovs children, this is Maria. She's a white one. She was the third daughter. She was, the white ones, we were talking about them earlier. They tend to be sort of a bit rebellious. And Maria, I think, is sort of the rebel of the Romanov family when they were sort of in the last days of their lives. They were prisoners for almost a year before they were finally executed. Over a year before they were executed. And Maria was someone who, like, they think she, sort of one of the guards in the prison, they were sort of like under house arrest, if you will. And one of the guards who was guarding them, they think that she was having some kind of fling with him and scandalizing the family and all this kind of stuff. And it seems like towards the end, she was kind of ostracized by the rest of the family for fraternizing with a guard. This is the guy I was talking about, who was the adopted son of the Tsar Nicholas, and he's one of the people who murdered Rasputin. And he's a blue 5. It's interesting, if you ever watch any movie where there's a disclaimer. South Park has the disclaimer, a sort of a parody of the disclaimer at the beginning of every TV show, where they say, any semblance to living people, living or dead, is merely a coincidence. I'm sure you've seen that in hundreds or thousands of movies that you've watched, that disclaimer. That disclaimer is actually in part caused by this guy and his wife, because in 1932-33, the Barrymores, Drew Barrymore's grandfather and great aunt and great uncle, there were 3 Barrymores who were famous actors, and the 3 of them, the only time that all 3 of them starred in the same movie was a movie about Rasputin and the Romanovs. And in the movie, they implied that this guy, even though he was married to reportedly the most beautiful woman in upper class Russia, was in fact homosexual. And because of this implication, he very successfully sued the film studio, even though he wasn't named. Like, they changed the character, the name of his character, but they implied that he was also gay. And so even though they had changed the name of the character, it resembled him too much. And he sued the film studio, and as a result, lawyers, Hollywood lawyers, insist on having that disclaimer in the movies to prevent instances like this guy suing as he did in the 1930s. Well, there's a little trivia for you. Anyway, he's a blue 5. I'm not going to take you through absolutely everyone. Some of this pertains more to the war than to the Romanovs, and I'm not sure how far to take you through all that. Tsar Nicholas himself was a red 3, which is interesting because Tsar Nicholas I, his great-grandfather, was also a red 3. But anyway, he's a red 3, while his wife and son, wait for it, while his wife and his son were blue 3s. So there's always a polarity. Red 3, blue 3 are polarities, just like black 3 and white 3, or red 3 and blue 3, or red 4 and blue 4, or any of those. So the Tsar's a red 3. And then his wife and the hemophiliac son are blue 3s. So there's something contained in that. Excuse me again. To add to it, not only was his wife a blue 3, but before he married his wife, he had a mistress, a ballerina, Matilda Chesinska, who was also a blue 3. She has a house. I've been to her house because today it's the Museum of the Soviet Union. After the Russian Revolution, the Bolsheviks themselves actually took over her house and turned it into sort of the Bolshevik headquarters. So there's, in St. Petersburg, there's a wonderful little Museum of the Soviet Union in her old house, just on the sort of the northern shore of the river. So yeah, those are the blue 3s. Now the other daughters, I'll take you through them. there is, of course, the famous, where is she? Okay, there's Olga. I'll get to her in a minute. Oh, yeah, I remember where she is. I remember. The famous Anastasia. She's more than a Disney character or anything. That she's the youngest of the four daughters. She's the one who's reported to have survived the execution. There was an imposter, a woman who pretended that she was Anastasia, who had survived the execution in the basement in that house of special purpose in Ekaterinburg. But yeah, she's a blue one. And then we have her other sisters. There's Olga, the Red Five, who was the oldest. She would have been, if there hadn't been a law. This is the terrible thing. Tsar Nicholas II, instead of going through all this stuff, this is my point, really. I've gone around it a lot, but Tsar Nicholas II, instead of like dealing with Rasputin and keeping his son's hemophilia a secret and all that stuff, he had the power to just change the law and allow women to be Tsarina again. And then this girl, Olga, could have been Tsarina. And look, even if you're anti-monarchist, you can appreciate how this is a poor decision on his part. Even if you're a frothing at the mouth Leninist Marxist and think that the murder of this family was by and large a positive event, if that's your position, you can still, as an astrologer, empathically understand that for Tsar Nicholas III, as of the second, that this one simple choice to not change the law, because he's a Taurus. He doesn't change laws. The what is, and you sort of stick with the system. But if he had changed the law, he had it in his power to do that. And then, this girl could have been Tsarina and could have ruled Russia and probably would have been perfectly good and, no worse than any man at the job. So there you go. Feminist rant over. Secondly, the last of the daughters, this is the one I find really interesting. The second oldest daughter was Tatiana, who actually was thought to be kind of the leader of the sisters, even though she was the second oldest. And she's a red one, just like Catherine the Great was a red one. And of the people shot in the basement on July 17th, 1918, she was one of two red ones killed in that basement. The other having been Botkin, the family doctor, who was killed alongside the family. So there's this whole other pattern of Russian leaders having red one children. She's just one of many of them. I won't go through that. That's time for another talk. But anyway, this is the whole Rasputin sort of story. I should just get to that. Where am I looking here? I'll go earlier. The Russian Revolution began in February. So this is just a few months after Rasputin has been killed. Rasputin was killed during, if I'm not mistaken, a White 2 interval as well. He born and died under a White 2. Is that right? Yeah. Born under a White 2, died under a White 2. So following that White 2 in 1916 when he was killed, the first of two Russian revolutions erupted in 1917. There had also been a Russian Revolution in 1905 during a red one, and this is now a blue one. So there's that 12-year Jupiter return, but also the sort of the polarity between the blue one and the red one. So shortly after the uprising, Tsar Nicholas II abdicated, and this was also during a blue one. And then as we got into a black 5, do I not have the black 5? What about the red 4? I need some more slides here. Okay, I'm missing. Oh, geez. I'm sure I have it. I think I just have to put it in this file. Let's see. Bear with me, folks. I know I have a slide for this. I have to look for Group 5 events. Let me check in with chat here. Oh, former Orthodox priest there. Columbus, America has an interesting question I'll get to in a minute. Okay, let me just find this slide for my own gratification here. Black 5 events. There we are. I knew I had it. All right. So there we are. The Russian Revolution. Now, so I showed you in February it started during a blue one, and then we get to the Black 5, and the Black 5 is when the Bolsheviks take over. That's the second part of the Russian Revolution. What's interesting about this to me is Black 5. The blue 1 to Black 5 period in history doesn't just cover the sort of peak of the Russian Revolution. You find the same thing with France, where the storming of the Bastille, going into the first sort of siege of Versailles, where they took the royals and escorted them from Versailles back to Paris, back to the Tuileries, where they could be, with the people. That was also in 1789, the blue 1 to Black 5 interval, and the Chinese Civil War that led to the establishment of the People's Republic in 1949. That was also during a Black 5. So there's something. Oh, and when the Berlin Wall would come down in 1989, that was in a Black 5 going into a Red 4. The Tiananmen Square massacre was blue 1 earlier in 1989. So there's something about that blue 1, Black 5, Red 4, those intervals, that era, that seems to be like, especially revolutionary. And I remember thinking during the last Black 5 at the end of 2021, this is when Russian military was starting to surround Ukraine, and people were speculating, is there going to be a war? I certainly, I think I was doing a webinar in November then, and I pointed out that the Venus return that was coming up from the invasion of Crimea in 2014, that would be coming up with the Red 4 of 2022. Yeah, it really does seem to be an especially sort of explosive or revolutionary time. 3 of those major revolutions having sort of reached their apex during those parts of the intervals. So following the Bolshevik takeover, there was, during the Red 4 that followed in early 1918, the Bolsheviks and the Germans, the Central Powers, but mostly the Germans, the Austrians were really sort of a junior power. They negotiated, Russia's end of involvement in World War I, and they gave up all this territory. And this is the reason Putin is so down on the likes of Lenin, not for his authoritarianism, excuse me, but rather for giving up so much territory during the war at a time when they probably couldn't have won at this point. It was really a hopeless cause. But anyway, there you are. That's the Red 4 sort of part of it. And then but the Russians were still involved in a civil war. And that involved fighting white Russian leaders such as Kornilov, who was a Siberian Cossack, and Wrangel, who was another one of the sort of the white Russian leaders. These were the anti-Bolsheviks. But at the same time, the guy who actually was in charge of murdering the Romanovs and who led the troops into the basement to shoot them, he was also a white 3, which is funny enough because he also, when he had the Romanovs killed, it was during a white 3. So the guy who was in charge of the execution was a white 3, and the execution happened during a white 3. And that's also when, these guys are in the last throes of trying to fight the Bolsheviks, and they're not going to win. So yeah. Oh yeah, of course. And Franz Joseph of Austria-Hungary, who had been the leader of Austria-Hungary when the war broke out, he was also a white 3. Okay, let me check with the questions. I don't necessarily have to stick with the Romanovs all day. Oops, that's not the one I want. All right, yeah, I wanted to go to Columbus, America's question. Wow, there's so many questions here. Um, the questions about the moon, Chelsea, are like sort of another factor because we're just looking at Venus here. I mean, of course, the moon matters, but if we're just looking at Venus, Venus's relationship to the moon, like, yeah, I mean, there's all kinds of intricate questions there, but I'm nowhere near being able to really answer them. Like, but they're good questions to ask. They're perfectly sensible questions to ask. But yeah, like if you have a full moon and a evening star Venus or a new moon and a morning star Venus, do these things matter relative to each other? I mean, probably, but not in any way I can really fathom yet. So Columbus America says, "Hi Nick. Of course, eminence makes things more simple. Famous poetic, politic figures, musicians, artists. Have you done some pattern analysis or thematic clustering in less famous, eminent people such as clients?" Yeah, I mean, I use this method with clients all the time. I don't talk about clients, publicly. The thing about booking a service with me is it's completely confidential. I know some astrologers use client charts. Uh, as examples, but it's just not something I'm comfortable with. It's not part of, when someone gives me a fee and has my, shares their the deepest, most intimate parts of their lives with me for an hour, and we talk about them. That's that's something that I just think is too sacred to sort of talk about outside of the context. And also, I want to speak very freely about astrology, so I find it like that this kind of historic exploration, I liken it to like an autopsy. We're like we're cutting out livers and showing them and brains and hey, look at these brains and measuring them and talking about their consistency. And you just don't do that to living people, right? We accept that you can do that with corpses, and it advances our knowledge of anatomy and biology and stuff. But yeah, I just think, especially the way I do astrology, if I was to talk about clients, it would be talking about like just the most heavy duty things and people who are still wrestling with whatever it is that we've spoken about. So it's just not appropriate for me, for my, for where my boundaries are. Some astrologers are comfortable with it, and I don't judge, but it's just not something I can do. And I think, the thing is, insofar, I mean, you hear this sometimes, there's nothing special about famous people, like this Russian royal family. I'm not a monarchist. I see them as being, sorry, I'm going to stop sharing here for a second. So I can speak more directly. The story I just told about the Romanovs. I mean, the fact that they're royals, I mean, it's obviously it's important to the story, but the main thing is their parents who are worried about the health of their child, who are worried about their place in their community. There's a lot of things about their story that you can easily transpose to a non monarchic, non elevated, non sort of mythical status. They're human beings, um, struggling with something that could cause them problems in their community and their standing in their community. And they're obviously they're loving parents. I mean, I have nothing nice to say about Tsar Nicholas II as a monarch, but he was a devoted father. He did love his family. Um, yeah, I'd say he's a pretty good father, except for the fact that getting them murdered in a basement is probably a parenting fail. But everything aside from that is, he was known to be a very devoted, a pretty good father. Some really great people, Einstein was supposedly a terrible father. So, sometimes these terrible people are good parents. Sometimes these really good people are terrible parents. I mean, human beings are paradoxes. But yeah, they're human beings struggling with a situation. So I think, yeah, sometimes people want to sort of, think that I'm just sort of picking from these eminent people, and whereas I think maybe the thing that people don't understand is I don't think of them as eminent. I mean, I recognize that they were seen as eminent, but I just see them as people. Absolutely everyone, the really evil ones, the really good ones, whatever. I'm, they're just people. People making decisions, sometimes making decisions that are, fortuitous and lead them to good opportunities, and sometimes they're making decisions that are disastrous and harm not only themselves but a lot of people around them. These are all sort of human condition things. That this is you don't need to be a really eminent person in order to have that kind of impact on other people. It is a bit exaggerated, obviously, like having a whole country and empire fall apart because you're worried everyone's going to find out you have a hemophiliac son. That is admittedly a rather extraordinary set of circumstances, but there's all kinds of things about the story that I think are just plain human. There's no other way around it, and that's certainly how I approach it. I'm looking at people with horoscopes and talking about their lives. Okay. People are still okay. So, okay. So yeah, crushed orchids mentions patterns in families. Yeah, I mean, I'm interested in patterns in families. Admittedly, when I think of the families I've studied, they are all sort of eminent one, like the Kennedys, because there's 9 kids in the Kennedy clan. The John F. Kennedy generation of that family. Napoleon's family, because he had all these siblings who were each like a character in themselves. Um, Lenin's family, who are not imminent in like the way the others are, but eminent in their own way. Lenin wasn't the only sort of radical extremist in his family. All of his siblings were. His oldest brother was executed by the Tsar for plotting his murder, and that sort of sparked the rest of the Ulyanovs to dedicate their lives to overthrowing the Russian throne. So there's an interesting sort of thing there, and they're each in their own. Their stories are really that all these different charts are connected in interesting ways by virtue of their Venus synodic cycles, and there's a lot I can say about them. That's time for a whole other talk in itself. Okay, Crushed Orchid says, "Oh yeah, this is something right away. This is something I gotta just sort of get out of the way because a lot of people want to know what their intervals are, and what I gotta tell you is, click this link that I've put in chat. I've also put it in the I've edited into the text below my introduction to the Venus synodic cycle video. You can now look up your natal or any date, any Venus interval and phase at astroseek.com just by clicking that link and looking it up. So yeah, I sort of mentioned this offhand during the taping of the episode with Chris, but I realized actually this is new enough that we haven't even mentioned it on the live stream yet. Petter over at AstroSeek has included the calculation for the intervals and phases into his website. It's a really great website as it is, just for like as an astrological resource. Yeah, click that link and you can find out on your own what Venus interval and phase you were born under, and anyone else whose life you want to look at. Your partners, your parents, your kids, Tsar Nicholas III, what the second, there is no Tsar Nicholas III. Whoever, Hitler, knock yourselves out. It's there for everyone to use. And at least that part of the confusion can hopefully be addressed, because yeah, despite my best efforts, some people still seem to be confused by the interval and phase system, while I sit here sort of earnestly confused that it's I don't know how much more simpler I can make it, but hopefully it catches on, because it's worth knowing. Especially I'll say, like, mostly it's worth knowing just because it helps you give a sense of where Venus is in its phase at any given time, and you start to become aware, as I've sort of illuminated in earlier workshops. There are some people for whom, like, particularly if they're Leo rising, you'll get the Venus retrograde in Leo crossing their ascendant. That'll always be this generally this really important sort of period of turning points that occurs every 8 years. Or if you're Scorpio rising, the red 2 Venus retrograde that happened in 2018, that'll happen again in 2016. It's just really worth understanding where Venus is in its phase, not merely that it's in a given sign or in a given house. The phase itself sort of points you towards like where it is in its motion. Is it heading towards a retrograde, or is it heading towards an external conjunction with the sun? Something of that nature. And you want to have a sense of that. It's worth knowing in any kind of astrological work that you do. All right, let's see here. I am sort of starting to fade. Have I broken down the Mars intervals? I do. I have the Mars cycle memorized, and I've plotted it out. It's a little trickier to work into a system the way I have with Venus, because it's asymmetrical as opposed to Venus, which is symmetrical. Venus is very easy to just break down into these 20 even parts, and you've got this. It's elegant. It's that's the thing. It's so damn simple, as opposed to Mars, which is the cycle of the synodic cycle of Mars involves alternate sums of 15 and 17. And it's wobbly. I mean, it has a sort of a perfection of its own, but it's very, very different from Venus. And so it's difficult to sort of, I'm still working on that, really, to sort of come up with a graph or a wheel of some kind that just perfectly describes how the Mars synodic cycle operates in such a simple image. But it's tricky. I'm still working on it. I certainly have a lot to say about Mars, just as much, if not more, as I do for Venus. But it's a little harder to stratify into the sort of a simple system like that. All right, I'm going to take one last question from Bliss2B, and then I think I'm running out of energy here. Bliss2B asks, can I compare the synodic phases to how the lunar phases are described? As in, if you were born under a new moon, it may imply that something about your personality due to that particular lunation. That's basically, yeah. That's basically the idea. Like, just as the moon can be waxing and waning, Venus has its own sort of waxing and waning energy here. I would say the new moon is the interior conjunction and the full moon is the exterior conjunction. So halfway through the red interval, at the beginning of a white phase, which is at the second half of the red interval, that's where I would consider the sort of new Venus to be, for want of a better term. So yeah, no, it's absolutely, these are phases, yeah, I mean, this is when Galileo looked through his telescope and saw that Venus had phases, this was part of what determined the heliocentric model, ironically. So so here I am, an astrologer, taking his work and reintroducing it into an astrological context, I guess. Although really, I think this is just a rediscovery on my part. I think this kind of knowledge, not necessarily my specific system, but this kind of knowledge of the Venus synodic cycle, I think, is very likely very ancient and something that we've just lost from, our modern astrology, and that needs to be reintroduced. All right, I'm starting to really lose it. I certainly hope today has been fruitful for you guys. I'm never really sure. Like I said, I do my best. I just come on and talk for an hour, and it might be great or it might be clumsy. I do my best, but I try not to try too hard, to just be sincere, give my best shot at it. I think it's good for me to just, talk out loud to a camera once or twice a week. And the feedback is always really sort of stimulating and encouraging. I'm not too worried that some of you are still struggling to follow, because I know you'll catch up. It's not that complicated. Thankfully, I've finally sort of shown you guys that the AstroSeek, website where you can calculate your own interval and phase, whatever interval and phase you want to look at. So at least now you can, and once you can sort of look at it on your own and not just in my video, I imagine that'll start to really help people catch on. All right. Well, that's it for me today. Yeah, okay, so, fantastic. Thank you all for, participating. Thank you for your questions. These live streams definitely go better when I have really, really great questions and really great feedback, which I'm always, pretty much guaranteed with you guys, so I'm really grateful for that, and, excuse me. Um, yeah, I can be found at nickdaganbestastrologer.com, and, I do a team stream with Patrick Watson every Sunday at 2 PM Eastern Time, 11 Pacific Time, and the solo stream like today every Monday, same times. So, hopefully I'll see you next Sunday. Hopefully I'll see you next Monday. And, yeah, I mean, you folks let me know. I can keep talking about Venus, the Venus synodic cycle, but I am interested in branching off into Mars as well. I know the thing is transiting Venus is about to go retrograde, so I just figured, a lot of people are super curious about that, and that's understandable. Of course, if you want to know what I would think about it relative to your own chart in life, I'm available for consultations. Um, but eventually, I will get around to talking about the synodic cycle of Mars because that's a really juicy one. And ultimately, the cycles of Venus and Mars are connected. That shouldn't surprise anyone. Since the synodic cycle of Mars, there are alternate sums of 15 and 17. So the first Mars return is at 15. But the second one is 17 years later at 32, which is a multiple of 8. And so at 32 and 64, you get this joining of the Venus and Mars synodic cycles. This is something I mentioned yesterday, I know, and a few times before. So, yeah, just in a really sort of direct way, those two cycles connect. And learning this part of the Venus cycle and getting these intervals and phases, understood and being on solid ground with them, that'll help you follow me as I take you into the whole Venus Mars relationship, which is, just that much more stimulating and interesting. All right, folks, have yourselves a terrific Monday. Thank you again for tuning in. My name is Nick Dagan Best, always will be. And yeah, have yourselves a terrific day, terrific week. Bye for now.